Hey guys, my name's Jonah of Doughboy Blades, and today I would like to talk to you about sheaths, specifically how we make our kydex sheaths. We used to press sheaths to each individual knife. So if we were making a batch of micro beekeepers, that sheath was pressed to that specific knife, and it only fit that knife. We used to use a very simple wood and foam system. Heat the kydex up, fold it around the knife, clamp it together. As it cools down, it forms to that shape. Really basic, very inexpensive, obviously. This is actually, I used this mold for a very long time, and usually you would put a hinge here. I was just too lazy to do that, and I never did. But now our sheaths look like this, and the process to make them is very different. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. I have a lot of thoughts about sheaths in general, but in this video I'd like to just talk about the process and save the design aspects for a different video. There are 8 steps to take a sheet of kydex from looking like this to a finished sheath like this. We need to press, drill, cut, trim, bend, rivet, buff, and assemble. Those are the 8 steps. And now I'm going to walk you through what each of those actually means. Our first step in the process is to take our kydex from a flat sheet like this to the shape that we want it to be in, like this. We use our HDPE molds that we make on the CNC router. This allows us to iterate very fast, customize every aspect of the mold. Very nice. So we heat the kydex up in a t-shirt press to about 370 degrees. At that temperature it becomes flexible. Then you remove it from the t-shirt press, put it over the mold on the vacuum table, turn the vacuum pump on, and it'll basically suction to that table, pull all the air out from underneath the kydex, and form exactly to these molds, giving us the precise shape that we want. From there you just have to cool it down with an air compressor and remove that mold, cool the inside. You want to make sure that it's super cool in this process, because it can look like you got a good mold, but if you have residual heat in that kydex, it wants to revert back to its original flat shape. So that's the first step. It's very satisfying to watch, because as soon as that suction is made, it just. Our next step is to drill the holes in our actual sheath, and on our mold we have little divots, and so we take that to our drill jig, and this just holds the sheath in place so that you can just use a drill with 2 hands. That's really nice, so you don't have to hold the sheath and then use a drill with 1 hand. You can simply clamp it down and then rock and roll through those holes. We have our drills lined up with all the drill bits already in them, so you can just, oh, this hole gets this size drill bit. Let me rock through those and then through the rest of them. And the last step is a little chamfer bit that just cleans up the burrs that you get from the drill bits. Now we can move on to cutting the rough shape of our sheath. Our mold has a little shoulder that shows you where to cut in this process. So you can basically just follow that line with your bandsaw and cut out the rough shape. Pre-cutting the sheath to its rough shape is important, because the next step is to trim the mold with a trim router. So we have these 3D printed jigs with steel posts in them, and those locate on the holes of the sheath. And basically, in our table router, we have a flush cut bit. So there's a bearing on the bottom, and the trim mold rides along that bearing, and any excess kydex hanging over this mold is trimmed away. And the reason that you really do need to rough cut the sheath before this is that machine wants to grab and throw this kydex. I mean, it's a pretty scary machine. The bandsaw and the trim router are the most dangerous machines in the shop, funny enough. But having very little material to remove makes that whole thing a lot safer to use, and you don't end up with scrap, because sometimes it'll bite and dig in and just ruin that sheath completely. So all the steps that you've done prior are wasted because you've now scrapped it. So having that little line to follow on the bandsaw makes the next step much safer and much more consistent. Once you've trimmed it on the trim router, you end up with a sheath that's the exact shape that you want. The edges aren't incredibly clean because you can still see some of those cut marks. That's alright, we're going to solve that later on in the buffing step. But the shape is very precise, and we're ready to bend the sheath now. Our bending process is a little funny. We use a curling iron, and the curling iron works well. I've tried a couple different things for bending the sheaths. The curling iron, you can set the temperature, so you can set it to 370 degrees. So if you keep the Kydex on for a little too long, you're not going to burn it. There's some other heating elements that I've used that get too hot. You can't get them low enough, and you end up burning the Kydex, and burning Kydex is super bad for your health. So the curling irons are the way to go. They're super inexpensive. They work really well. And as you can see, our sheath has a little line in the center that we've already put into the mold to help you locate on that curling iron so that you can get straight in the middle and know exactly where to bend without having to mark anything or any extra jigs on top of what we already have. Once you put the sheath on the curling iron and it's up to temperature, you basically fold it over, insert your blank knife, and then put it into a foam press, much like the one that we used to use. What this does, this blank knife basically has the tip cut off, and that's so it doesn't interfere with the two divots that are at the front of the sheath. These are designed to touch the blade and prevent it from rattling, so we don't want to interfere with that, because if we have a full-length blade, it can basically push those out so that it doesn't actually touch the blade when we go to insert the real knife. So this basically prevents the sheath from collapsing on itself, and then the foam keeps the sheath from expanding out. So as it cools in that press, you get the exact shape that you want. So it's very simple, but really effective. And you end up with this, a sheath that doesn't have any rivets in it yet, but holds its shape and has retention even at this point without the rivets. Once your sheath is bent, you then need to drill through these holes on the drill press. You can use a drill, but it's just easier for us because we have a little drill press, and that's basically because if there's any misalignment in any of these holes, that's going to turn the rivet and end up warping the sheath. So what we want to do is we want to drill straight through those holes perpendicular so that our rivets can press nice and perpendicular to our sheath. Our next step after we've prepped all the holes is to rivet. This is a really simple step. Just insert your rivets, use the arbor press to the trick here is not to overpress the rivets and not to underpress the rivets. It's pretty simple. If you overpress them, you can tear them, and then you have to remove that and install a new one. It's a big pain. But overall, this is a very straightforward step. After you've riveted the knife, you now have a working sheath, but the edges are still really rough and sharp because they're 90 degrees. So we need to take this to the buffer and remove all those edges, clean up some of the cut marks that were left from the trim router, and just polish this thing up, basically. Funny enough, the buffing step in this process is actually the most difficult to do because it requires the most finesse. It's the hardest to automate, and I'm actively working to create a process around this step so that it's easier for people to not mess up here, basically. After you've buffed the sheath, we can now clean it up and assemble it. So it has a bunch of Kydex dust everywhere. We need to blow that out with an air compressor and then do our final assembly install of our adjustable retention. You can see on these newer sheaths, there's actually 2 holes that you can choose. That's on purpose. The hole that's closer to the tip is going to be for lighter retention. If you want even more retention than that, one, you can turn the screw and tighten it from there, but you can also move this whole set of hardware to that further hole and really clamp down on the knife at that retention point on the scales. One thing I'd like to mention, in this process, you can't just make a knife by hand and then expect this process to work. You first need to standardize certain aspects of the knife, specifically the scales, which is what our sheath grabs onto for retention. So step 1 in all of this is make your scales on a CNC router. That's something I've been working on for a long time, and I feel like I've come a long way in this step. But these are scales straight off the machine. I've done nothing to them. They're ready to bolt to the knife, and all that has to be done now is to clean up the perimeter, basically. So match up the scales to the actual knife, clean everything, make it all a consistent grit. That 8-step process is essentially the same for all sheaths, but there are a few differences in the few different styles of sheaths that we make. The first type of sheath that we make is the process that I just showed you. It's the fold-over sheath for a knife. So this is, one piece of Kydex that's bent and then riveted. So that's going to be essentially all the knives plus the jacks, which is a pry tool. Mini beekeeper, cuttlefish. That process is the same for all of these. The next style of sheath is a 2-piece riveted sheath. So that's going to be basically schisms and middies, where you have a left side and a right side, and then instead of bending them, you just rivet them together. There's advantages and disadvantages to both of these styles. I'm going to talk more about that in the design video that I'm going to make, but these basically you don't have to do the bending step, but all the other steps are essentially identical. And the last style of sheath that we make is a bit of a unique one. It's the elastic retention sheath. So that's going to be our G10 knives and our deep carry sheaths, basically. So right here we have our -0 slip. This is where all this started. I learned a lot with this little one. I'll definitely be talking about this in the design video, because there was a lot of iteration that came from this little sheath and then expanded into deep carry sheaths and G10 sheaths. But basically these are 2-part sheaths that are then attached with elastic or shock cord, and there's a few 3D printed pieces on the inside that prevent you from cutting the elastic. And so on these sheaths, they skip the rivet step, they skip the bend step, but essentially the same process. You just have a little bit more assembly with these, because weaving that shock cord through there takes a little bit of time. So I've showed you this whole process, and you may be wondering, why did you spend all the time to do this? It's like you had a very simple process with your foam press. This is super inexpensive. Why didn't you just make more of these? Make this a little bit better. And it's a good question. Our goal is to grow. And in order to grow, we need standardized, robust, scalable processes. And this is, basically what we're doing on a big picture with the business is we're identifying bottlenecks and making processes to fix those bottlenecks. And so sheaths were a big bottleneck for me personally. I know there's people out there who can just crank through sheaths. It's crazy to watch some of these guys work. If you follow Lex Rex on Instagram, he's just a monster with his sheath making process. He can just crush 30 sheaths in like no time. It's wild. That process, if you want to know the way that I used to make sheaths. Basically, that process is almost exactly how I used to make sheaths. It just took me way longer than it takes him. But the real reason behind it, so one is efficiency, but really it's the repeatability of this process. So I developed this process, I worked through it myself, but now it's at a place where I can train somebody in a very short amount of time and have them run the process. So I've had a couple part-time guys in here making sheaths. My dad comes up and helps me make sheaths, and that's great because while sheaths are running and I can be making knives, and at the end of that process, those just match up perfectly, and I don't have to spend any time making sheaths. This process is very scalable, and at this point, it is no longer a bottleneck. We can crank through sheaths pretty efficiently, and I can't keep up with the pace of making knives. So it's great. We've eliminated that bottleneck for the meantime. Whoa, my chair just break? My free chair that I got out of somebody's front yard broke. Jesus, everybody's telling me I'm too fat. I have 3 bikes with broken spokes on them, by the way. It's like, alright, universe, I get it. I need to lose some weight. I'm going to cut myself off here. I could talk for a very long time, obviously, about sheaths. It's something that I think a lot about because they're so important. A bad sheath can ruin a good knife, and it's a big part of how you actually use that knife. So in the design video, I'm going to talk a lot about decisions, why sheaths are shaped a certain way, what certain features are on them. If there's a specific knife you want me to cover, if there's a specific topic within sheath design you'd like me to talk about, drop in the comments. And I really appreciate you watching this video. By watching this video, you are helping me do more of this. So I really appreciate it. Appreciate your time, and see you later. There's our kitty. Still not my friend.